let's make this less formal, not like the news, we are not,
Sure.
we're just
Perfect.
a really small news outlet, so that's good.
All
We're
right.
actually trying to make a side project about history and mythology, and as you make
Right.
a lot of historical music,
Yeah.
yeah, I decided
Well,
to
thank
make,
you.
to, well, I like your music.
Thank you. I'm
First
honored.
thing, yeah,
Thank you very much.
to hear as much from you.
Thank you.
Okay, then, how did you decided to to start with historical reconstructions and maybe not only reconstructions, but also creating pseudo-historical music
Yeah.
in a convincing way?
I think I've always been interested in history. My primary background is in history, actually. So I have no education in I had no musical education. I have no academic background in music. It was always history, my main thing. And
Where did you study that?
here I studied at well, different places because in Quebec we have two levels of higher education. So we have Cégep, which is like college, is pre-university, and then we have university. So I studied at Collège Lionel Groux here in Quebec, and then UQAM, which is the University of Montreal, which is one of the main universities of Quebec in Canada.
So you were instructed in French, educated in French, maybe.
Yes. My
Ah,
my my
great.
my main my main language is French. I speak English very rarely, actually. So it's usually for my channel I speak English, but then it's
Yeah, I heard you
99%.
speak mainly English, of course.
I
Except
yeah, but
when you sing Quand je bois du vin claret.
well, no, that's the thing actually. In my daily life, I speak French
Ah,
usually. So French is like my main language, and it's only for my YouTube job and everything that I use English. So yeah,
and
most
of
of my
course you speak
education,
Farsi.
of course, yeah, I also speak Farsi. Yeah.
Okay, then please go on with. I interrupted you.
No problem. So yeah, so that's the thing. My background was in history, and music was a hobby for me.
Hmm.
And then naturally, I decided to sort of, combine the two together. And I mean, it's historically speaking, it's an old tradition. You go as far back as the Iliad, for example, which was, yes, it was a poem, but it was also sung. So it was music in a sense. And
Yes,
to
probably it
Homer,
was accompanied by a lyre.
oh yeah. Well, it was sung, it was accompanied by a lyre, exactly. It
Hmm.
was the main um instrument for poetic the epic poetry tradition. And we see, of course, parallels in the skaldic tradition of the Norse. Your neighbors, the Serbians, they have the gusle, and they sing those epic poetry songs and everything
Hmm.
about like the cycle of Kosovo and everything. And it's always about historical events, right? So it's throughout human history, you see that even to Homer, the Trojan War probably happened, I think, 800 years before he lived. If he lived, the Trojan War would have been in the past for him.
Yes,
I think
probably
something like
if he existed, he maybe thought of it as history
exactly to him it was already
or
history,
something
right?
that happened.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So I think there's a natural human instinct throughout history to make music about the past. So I was interested in doing that, but my initial obstacle was that nowadays I think there's a instinct we have to always go for an orchestral sound, right? That it has to be the opera, the orchestra, the Western sort of musical, the Wagner, for example, operatic sound and everything. Usually that's the instinct that a lot of people have.
I believe you mentioned this in one of your self interviews
Yeah.
that that when we think about Roman music, for example, we think about symphonies made in Hollywood.
Yeah, we think about orchestras and everything.
Yeah,
And if you use actual Roman instruments, it sounds more like Bulgarian folk music, for example, than it sounds like,
yeah, it's more or less Mediterranean, of course.
it's Mediterranean that has roots and everything. So anyway, so I was interested in sort of bridging the gap between the two by employing the sounds of the cultures themselves. So I thought to myself, well, if I'm going to make historical music about Bulgaria, for example, I just use Bulgarian folk music as the musical language to tell that story, to frame that story in a way. And so that's really it's making historical reconstructions, of course, is if available, I'll do historical reconstructions, right? I would rather do historical reconstructions if we have the data. Unfortunately, for a lot of history, we don't have access to their music. So I'm like,
Well,
well,
then
the
an
best
approximation.
we can approximate, but some things, for example, like let's say ancient Egyptian music is completely lost. I mean, it's unrecoverable, basically. The music of the Ptolemaic era, we can recover it because it would have been Greek music in the
More
courts.
or less Greek, yes.
But otherwise, if you go back to the era of the pyramids, for example, we have no idea. We know what the instruments were, but apart from that. And so in that case, what I do
For
is I'm
example,
like,
could we use something like any information from the Old Testament,
I mean,
at
the
least
problem is
theoretically?
the Old Testament, the problem is they give you very vague descriptions, right? They'll say that, for example, Samson played on his lyre. It's like, okay, but like, how did he play? What kind of melodies were there? What kind of technique did the vocals use? It's unfortunately, it's so vague that if you are going to try to do reconstructions, they're going to be so speculative that at that point they're basically imagination. So you might as well just make modern music with a historical theme, which is something that I also do basically, because at
People
that
do
point
that. You do that, yes, of course.
I do so, yeah. So I do both. So for example, I will do historical reconstructions of Roman music as it would have sounded, like approximating as closely as possible. But then, sometimes maybe I need some extra money from the YouTube ads, so I will make a pseudo-historical sound that's more modern, that'll get more
The
views.
so-called epic Roman thing, yes.
Right, the epic
Yeah, this
Roman
is quite
things,
pleasant, actually.
they're quite pleasant, and I call them they're the gateway they're the gateway drug in a way,
Right.
right? So it that's the ones that get a lot of views. It brings people in, and then it's like, well, look, there's actual historical reconstructions, and that's how you can bring a
Hmm.
bigger audience to that. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah,
It made a great impression on me that you're using a lot of instruments. And now you
yes,
say you didn't start as a professional musician. You started
no,
as a historian,
yeah,
actually. So it was a step from history to music and not vice versa.
yeah, exactly, yeah, yeah.
That sounds quite impressive. And you're as well, you're singing in quite a number of languages. It's not only French, Farsi, and English. It's wow, it includes
Yeah, but at this point, I've had to do many of the languages of
some Slavic
Europe.
languages.
And Slavic languages. Yeah, I've done a few Slavic languages also. I mean, it's part of the job, right? You have to be able to, because if you, to me, the language is part of the music as much as the music. So often people they they distinguish, let's say you'll have the gaida, for example, the Bulgarian bagpipe,
Hmm.
and then but they'll say and then the language is over there. And I'm like, no, for me, the sounds of the language and the sound of the bagpipe, they form a soundscape of Bulgarian music. You cannot separate them. To me, the Bulgarian language is as much one of the instruments or one of the sounds of the music as the instruments are.
Now, of course, when we finish this conversation and I make the record and we publish it,
Yeah.
some people hearing about a Bulgarian bagpipe, they will decide that Bulgarian are Celts or something like that. Of course, we're not
Yes.
a Celtic nation.
That's a very interesting point you're bringing up. Yeah, there's these it's a big theme that I bring up in many of my video essays, which is these associations that we have. So
Mhm.
in the Western world, especially, right? So in the English speaking world, the Scots are the main people who use bagpipes in the English speaking world. So because of that, in the Anglosphere, people tend to think that it's like a Scottish thing, and so then they extrapolate that it's like a Celtic thing. And so very often people will see that there's bagpipes in Bulgaria and they'll say, well, that's Celtic influence. It's like, not actually. Bagpipes, we
Well, it's
know they came.
European.
It's broadly European,
Hmm.
even broadly West Eurasian, actually. You find it even in parts of Asia and North Africa and the Middle East. We know that it originated somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Middle East. So if anything, the Scots were probably one of the last peoples geographically to get bagpipes to them. We know the
Never
Romans
say
had
that.
them also, for example.
Never
Yeah.
say that. They're so proud of their bagpipe and they're good at that.
Oh yeah, yeah, they're amazing. They have an amazing bagpipe tradition. But I also want to bring a lot of attention, for example, to the bagpipe traditions of Thrace in Bulgaria, for example, or the Rhodope Mountains, which are absolutely amazing. Some of the most incredible bagpipe traditions on earth.
Yes, they use two types of bagpipes there.
Yeah,
The one, the deep bagpipe, and
the Kabav
yeah, the
and
kabab.
the
Yes,
yeah,
precisely.
Kabav, yeah.
Yeah, right. You make a lot of co-workings, or at least so I've gathered, and
Oh yeah,
I find it really pleasant that you're working with Skaldic Bard.
yes,
One, he's another of my favorite musicians. I
he's
hope to be
amazing.
able to
He's
talk to him
amazing.
as well.
Oh yeah, you should talk to him. He's amazing. He's a lovely lad, lovely, lovely
I'm
person.
pretty sure he is. Yes, of course, because
Yeah.
yeah, his work is also remarkable.
Oh
And
yeah, yeah.
the amount of work, the sheer amount of work you're putting in that, are you making that into your main job?
I mean, currently it's one of my main jobs. Yeah. So there's this. I also do professionally, I'm a videographer and photographer, so I also do photography on the side and everything. And that I also do contracts, for example. So let's say a documentary needs a certain music, or so I'll compose music also. So those are my three main jobs basically. Yeah.
Yeah, my three main jobs. Yeah,
Yeah.
I used to be a historian before becoming a journalist, actually. So I
Right.
understand part of what you're doing, only a part of
Right.
it
Right.
because I'm no musician.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Okay, then. So it's the languages, it's the co-workings, it's the multi-instrumentalism.
I mean, the co-workings are really important because, um, I mean, that's because a lot of people say, for example, how do you get the sound of, I don't know, Greek music right? I work with Greek musicians. That's that's the secret, basically. It's just you work with the people from those cultures. And at this point, my channel is sort of a platform to pool together the skills of musicians from different traditions and everything. And so I just use or if I don't directly work with those musicians, I just copy paste the traditions basically. I just there's not much originality in my work. It's mostly doing my homework and, really sort of replicating the it's more like the work of, let's say, an archaeologist who reconstructs a vase, right? So when an archaeologist does a reconstruction of a vase, they're not being an artist in the same way that, let's say, Picasso was, when it's not just feelings. There's a lot of
They're
science
not looking for
involved.
originality, yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's mostly anthropological work, first and foremost. Yeah, yeah,
Anthropological, yes, indeed.
yeah.
And then you come with something like the beginning of the Ennies, which is not
Right.
something you hear every day.
No,
And
no.
it sounds original when you're not making it into epic Roman music, but you're making it into something more like musical reconstruction.
Yes,
The
historical
two things
approximation.
sound differently. And for some people, me included,
Yeah,
it sounds like the Ennies, the beginning of it, Arma, Virunque, Cano, and so on and so forth. It sounds like an original work. It sounds
yeah,
more
yeah,
exotic, more
yeah, 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 yeah,
unexpected.
yeah. I think that's one of the beauties of historical reconstructions. It's that it can open the door to sounds that are so extremely strange. I mean, ancient
Hmm.
Greek music is one of my favorites.
But it's
Ancient Greek music I mean, there's parts where it sounds Japanese sometimes. Some of the parts of ancient Greek music can remind people of Japanese. It's so strange. There's things they did that have completely been extinct musically. I think that's one of the great things about historical reconstructions. People are like, forget about the scientific side, just from the enjoyment side. There's sounds you can discover that we haven't heard for 2000 years basically, and you can unlock them. I mean, just for example, you mentioned the Ennead, right? So classical poetry was defined by rhythm, as you know.
yes,
So, for example, me myself, I think that mostly most peoples in Eurasia, the poetic traditions are mostly based on rhymes, on rhyming. It's I think it's the predominant one in many parts of
that's the
Europe and the
case in
Middle East.
Persian classical poetry as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's
Okay.
mostly Persian. And I may be wrong. I think it's Arabic influence. So I think that rhyming verses is a very strong Arabic influence from what I know. And I think it enters Europe with the Arabic influence in Al-Andalus, with the troubadours in southern France. I may be wrong on this. I'll have to check the data again, but I know that there is a strong correlation where before the early Middle Ages, you had mostly the rhyme of classical, and then you had the what is it called? The Germanic peoples. They have the alliteration.
Hmm.
They had the alliteration, alliterative verses. Um, but anyway, so the Aeneid is not rhymed. It's the rhythm that defines it.
That's classical, yes. That's
Yeah,
Greek
the
or
classical
classical,
rhythms.
yes.
And if you stick to the rhythm very closely, arma virumque cano Troia qui primus, you realize it's rap.
Yeah,
I mean, it's you realize that there was a tradition of what was basically rapping, a native European tradition of rapping 2000 years ago. So you discover amazing things, right, with historical reconstructions that are quite enjoyable, I think.
yeah, especially when when you try repeating those verses, same thing goes with the Iliad, of course. Many, Nae, Thea, Pele, Yodor, Achilles, and so on and so forth.
The next one is the Iliad, yeah. The next one that I'm working on is going to be
I was
the
going to
Iliad.
ask about that because I would
Yeah.
like to hear something like that.
Oh yeah. I mean, in the very long term, I will be putting the entire Aeneid and the entire Iliad to music. But
Now that's
yeah,
enormous.
but very long term. We're talking about years in the making. But I want to do that. I think it would be interesting to have at least one whole recording, musically with the rhythm and the meter and everything.
The whole Iliad and the whole Aeneid, that would be really amazing to hear.
It would be amazing. Yeah, I have a few epic. I have a general fascination with epic poetry in general. That's where my fascination with history started. So my long-term goals, there's the song, La chanson de Roland, the Song of Roland also
Carles
is
i
one of
reis
those.
nostrem perere magnes, set tantus prensa dested in España.
Exactly, yeah.
But
That's
I'm
also
sorry
the
for
one.
my pronunciation,
I was actually
which is
very
not as
good.
good.
Actually, I mean, your pronunciation is closer to, it was pretty close to Old French, closer than modern French is actually. So you're much better than modern French speakers, because modern French is so different from the
Maybe
old
my
one.
Bulgarian is a little bit better, but that's another matter. Yeah.
But yeah, no, epic poetry is something that has such a potential because it contains. It's interesting because usually epic poetry written down in history is about even older times
Mhm.
than when it was written. So the Song of Roland was written in the 1000s, I believe,
Maybe in the 12th century, yes.
12th century, but it's about like 300,
It's about
400
the
years
9th
before
century,
that.
or the end of the 8th century, something like that.
Right, right, right. The
Yeah.
end of the 8th century, Charlotte, the Carolingian era, basically. It wasn't written in the Carolingian era, right? Same thing with the Iliad, same thing with many poems. And so epic poems themselves are historical, and then they talk about even more ancient history. And because they can,
Yeah.
they're amazing. They're an amazing source of, and when you reconstruct music with them, it's one of the most satisfying historical experiences, in my opinion.
Right. I'm trying to delve into Beowulf because that's an interest of mine,
Yeah,
and trying to find scraps of historical information in it, not only
yeah,
poetical
yeah, yeah,
reality, because
yeah,
poetry is obvious there, but it's a difficult task, and sometimes it's a desperate task. I have to abandon some trait of thought because
right.
I cannot prove anything I've thought I found there, but I cannot find any proof of its reality. So when you leave that, when you leave the historical part of it, the textual part of it,
Yeah,
what remains is the poetry, and what remains is the musicality. It's the pure enjoyment.
yeah, yeah,
Is Old Norse and its its cousin branch in North European epic poetry,
yeah.
Anglo-Saxon poetry, is that musical? Is that pleasant?
Well, I mean, I believe they did accompany their music with a lyre. So we know that it was, in this sense, very close to ancient Greek music. Um,
At least the Beowulf poet tells us so.
yeah, exactly. And we have visual also the skulls. We see them with the lyre and everything. The lyre was, strangely enough, I mean, you start from Mesopotamia. It was the lyre that accompanied, I believe, the Epic of Gilgamesh. If I'm not wrong, I believe it was the lyre also. Then you go to the Iliad, and of course, the Iliad, that tradition of Greek epic poetry was itself Mesopotamian influence. The epic of, the lyre and everything. A lot of research that I did does show that that has precedence in Mesopotamian epic poetry, and so it makes its way westwards in Anatolia and everything. And then, of course, you find that with the skalds and everything. The problem, of course, is that we know almost nothing about early medieval Germanic music. It's very hard to reconstruct, and so
And rhythm is quite more tricky than classical one.
oh
It's
yeah,
not so strict, and
no, no,
that
no,
makes
it
it
is
difficult to read sometimes and difficult to wrap it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's not as easily rappable as the Iliad and
Precisely.
everything, but you know, I mean, it must have been something quite beautiful. Unfortunately, it's not very easy to reconstruct. It's we don't know much about their music. There's guesses that I've made, but it's what we have with them is pure speculation, right? So, for example, people ask me, for example, why don't you make, I don't know, reconstruct that kind of music? And I'm like, because it's not reconstructible, right? So, usually,
Some things are
yeah,
not, yes.
some things are not, and sometimes I think one of the things I always say in history, one of the most mature things you can do in history is to just give up and say we don't know.
Sometimes
Some
we do that, yes.
Sometimes we do that, yeah. So most of my reconstructions will be mostly in the classical world because we have so much information, unnaturally so for antiquity. But starting from the Middle Ages is when we have a lot of musical information about most cultures, I would say. But when it comes to the Germanic poetry, yeah, we don't know much, unfortunately.
Yeah, almost nothing. I believe several years ago, some archaeologists tried to reconstruct the carnix, the Celtic instrument, the Gallic
Yes.
instrument,
Yeah, yeah.
and maybe it was a success. But
I
now
believe
that they
I
had the instrument, what can they do with it?
So the Carnix, it was a trumpet, obviously. Now, to my understanding, it could
Something like a
only
war
do
horn, but a metallic one and a very tall one.
very high and very tall like
Precisely.
this. It has been, I mean, it has been reconstructed from, to my understanding, the reconstructions are deemed accurate.
Mm.
Um, I have used the sound of the Carnix in a few of my songs, so I did a reconstruction of Gaulish music, which is it's one of those where I'm like, here's the instruments, here's a plausible melody, and like it's a shot in the dark, basically, and there's some carnixes in the back.
It cannot be
Um,
Celtic. You didn't put any bagpipe there.
right, or the
Of course.
fiddle, or the,
Well, the
all
fiddle,
of
yeah.
those. Well, that was mainly the point of that. It wasn't to really try to reconstruct Gaulish music, but just to show that if you put the instruments of Gaulish music together, it sounds nothing like Celtic music that we are used to today.
And of course, as a French speaker, you must know that usually when Celts, ancient Celts, Iron Age Celts played music, they tied the bard.
Fantastic. That's that was a great, yeah, I know that was a great reference. It took me a second to get it. What was his name in do they translate the names in Bulgarian?
Yes, we do. I
Yeah.
believe in French he was Assurance Tourix,
Yeah, which is
and in
like
Bulgaria it's
tourist insurance.
Sebezrix.
What is it?
Sebezrix.
What is there a
All
meaning? Is
without
there
a risk. Everything without any risk.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Without any risks, of course.
Rix, yeah. That's the pun. The Carnix, it would have been close to the Roman tubas in the sense that from what I understand, most of them would not have been able to produce all the notes of the octave. So you wouldn't have been able to play complex melodies on it. So the Carnix would have done a few fundamental pitches. So for example, bo, 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 and that's like, like those three pitches basically. So it wasn't a musical instrument. It was a
War instrument.
military, yeah, it was a military signal, it was a war instrument. It would have been used for ceremonial purposes, but their their musical instruments would have been the same as the Romans, mostly lyre, the pan flute, etc. There wouldn't have been much difference necessarily in terms of instruments with the Romans.
Maybe some instruments imported from Greece, as they
Oh
had
yeah.
quite the trade with Greece, of course.
I mean, some of the tribes used the Greek alphabet, if I'm not wrong. I know there were right. So there was a lot of
Greek types of coinage.
right,
Yeah.
right. So there's also this. I mean, it's a point that's important to make. It's that we often create this somewhat artificially forced division between the Romans and the Celts. Whereas if you look at Gaulish, it didn't sound very different from Latin at a certain point, the phonology and everything.
Maybe something like archaic Latin, those with
Right. I mean, if
reduplications and everything ending at os, like in Greek,
right, there's
something like
this
that.
weirdly Greekish sonority to call it
Yes,
Gaulish actually, which is and of course you have, for example, the word scutum,
the shield.
shield,
Yeah,
comes from skutos in Gaulish. There were Gaulish words that came into Latin, of course, due to the Gaulish presence in Rome and everything. So yeah, they're not as. It's also a big thing that I always talk about. It's that cultures overlap to a massive degree. No culture is entirely pure in any sense. The Romans had Celtic aspects to them. The Celts had Roman aspects to them.
Romans were maybe more or less like the Japanese, successfully adapting everything from everywhere.
Yes, that was the big skill of the Romans. I
Mm.
mean, we see that with the Carthaginians, right? They were like, we don't know how to make ships. What do we do? We're going to copy the
We'll
Carthaginian
learn.
ships.
Yeah. with
that they were
Einstein.
sponges.
Yes, right,
Yeah,
sponges indeed. I've
yeah.
always been curious. There is this, I believe it's a 15th century mention, and it's not only in one place, but in several places in Irish texts, old Irish texts, that of a song which is legendarily held to be sung by Finn MacCool and his Fianna, the so-called Dort Fianna. I'm
I
not sure if I'm pronouncing it well because Irish is so difficult, but this Dort Fianna, is it attested anywhere? Is there any fragment of a text or some line of music pretending to be that?
I have never heard of it actually,
Hmm.
so it's I'm gonna have to do some research because that's interesting. I have begun last year actually doing some research into reconstructing um the Celtic music of the British Isles.
Hmm.
So I'm gonna have to look into that. I'm not sure about that. No. Very often what you do find, however, it's pretty funny. You do find mentions of songs. So an epic poem will say that they sang this song, but we don't have the song itself.
It's something like in the cycle of stories of Finn MacCool and the Fianna, it's something like the anthem of the group, of the
Right,
warrior band,
right,
and they sing it happily and loudly when they're happy, and they sing it very mournfully and slowly when they're, for
right.
example, like when they're mourning for some fallen comrade or something like that.
Yeah.
It's a curious thing.
It's we often don't have that. I mean, I think something that you and I both share in common is a great passion for Tolkien. He is my probably my favorite author. I'm a great fan of Tolkien's
One of
works
mine
and
as well,
everything.
yes.
Yeah, and you also have that in his work. So, for example, he tells us that the elves, they sing Ailbereth Gilthoniel, for example, and he gives us the lyrics, but we don't have the music, and so you have an entire tradition now of musicians making music for that.
We don't have the music, but in a way we do have it. First, because we have the text, and the text brings its own rhythm and the rhyme,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
the Elber
yeah,
et Giltonia, I believe it's rhymed.
yes,
And if I'm not mistaken, there is a recording of Tolkien's voice
you're right.
with
You're right. Who
singing
sings
not
it
that
actually? Yeah.
song exactly. I'm not sure if it was that or it was the Namaria song in Lorien.
I think it was Namari, I think it was Namari and Quenya, but yeah, so there's these parallels that you find in many great texts, and I consider Lord of the Rings, for me it's like a work of epic like I almost
It is
count it.
conceived like that. It was the idea of the author.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I almost don't. To me, it's one of those. It's up there with the Iliad. It's up there with. I'm a great fan of the just the whole Tolkien universe, not just the Lord of the Rings, obviously the
Hmm.
Silmarillion and everything. But you do have a precedence for that. That musical works are mentioned, but we don't have them, and very often the reason is because they didn't feel the need to tell us because everybody knew those songs back then, right?
Right.
So, for example, imagine if
Yeah, that's
our
irritating. That's annoying in old literature when you
it's
find
annoying, right?
some trace of something which doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, because to them it was, I mean, it's the equal, for example, I'll tell you, you know the American anthem. We both know what we're talking about.
Yes,
Now
of course.
imagine in 2000 years, somebody finds this interview, they'll see also they're mentioning the American anthem, but I
What
didn't
was
feel
it?
the need to sing it because we all know what it is, right? So that's often the problem
Yeah, we
with
don't
those
need
epic
to
poems.
discuss it further.
It's obvious already, right?
Yeah, right. Are you acquainted with the work of Azam Ali?
Yes,
Uh,
yes, yes, yes. I believe she's Iranian originally. She's also Iranian. She was born in Tehran, I believe. I do. Yeah, she does great work. I love her work. Yeah, yeah. She has a more the approach that I wish I could have more often, where she does a lot more fusion of different elements. For example,
that's
which is
true, yes.
beau which is beautiful. So, for example, she will fuse Iranian elements with Turkey Sufi elements and everything. Um, I mostly am very I'm a pedantic schoolboy. I tend to be very, like if I do a Turkish song, it's gonna be Turkish and that's it. And if I do Iranian, it's gonna be Iranian and like this. Because there's a lot of there's a lot of reinvention and fusion and everything going on. And I thought to myself, well, we need to have at least one library where the things are mostly, you know, um, sort of as they are to the culture originally. So that's usually what I do most of the time. But Azam Ali is an example of, you know, the evolution of that kind of music, right?
She
Because
makes entirely contemporary music, world music, as she calls it.
Right, right, exactly. It's world music in
When she makes a
the
French music, it sounds like a Zamali. When she makes a Turkish song, it sounds like a Zamali. That's my
it's
expressions.
her
It's a
touch, it's
different
her
thing. Yes.
style. It's like, for example, I call her the Middle Eastern. What's her name? The Canadian singer who does Irish songs. Um I forgot the name, but you have Enya, for example, also,
Mm.
right? To me, it's that beautiful branch of music of people who come from certain traditions, but then they evolve those traditions and they bring it to new horizons. So you have Enya, you have Azam Ali, you have those different artists that do beautiful work, absolutely beautiful work.
More precisely. She's been in Sofia at least once, maybe
Yeah.
more than once, but I know
Yes.
of one occasion for sure. And yes, I know you travel a lot, or maybe I'm mistaken.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I For my job,
You've
I
been in
travel.
Turkey, you've been in Greece,
Yeah,
all all around the place.
yeah.
And I think I have heard your music being played in Rome during the Natale di Roma historical festival
Yes, that was one of the uh, greatest honors, probably. They played my music in front of the Colosseum and the
a
Pantheon and everything.
few years
So
ago, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
they've been doing it for, I think, like 2 years in a row now.
Mm.
So the last 2 years, basically, they've been playing my music. I mean, it's great. It's just an honor. I would have never thought,
The
that
festival is really good. It's a
I would have.
pageant of ancient Romans, then
Yeah.
late antiquity Romans, some early Byzantines. That's
Oh, I have to go there. I mean, I've been to Rome also a few times when I was a kid because I grew up in the south of France. So of course I would travel to Rome. So I want to go back at some point.
South France. Oh, great. So
Yeah,
why don't you make something Occitan?
I did one, and then I have to do others. It's this funny thing where we often find ourselves more attracted to things that are exotic
Yeah.
rather than the things that are familiar to us, right? So, for example, you ask people, have you been to this country and this country? Yes, I've traveled. And say, have you been to like that other street next to your house? And they'll say, no, I haven't been. And I realize it's like this. I've been to Greece, I've been to Turkey, but like there's a street next to my house. I've actually never gone to that street. We have this weird thing. So Occitan music for me is I
Too
grew up with
familiar.
it. Yeah, almost to the point where it's not like as exciting to learn about and everything. But of course I have a mission to provide ethnomusicology, so I have to make more, obviously. Yeah.
Maybe the most exotic thing I heard from your work was the Huron carol, the Christmas song
Yes.
in some Native American language, which I couldn't understand, of course.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, to be clear, I did it only in French and English because the when that language
Mm. Yeah,
is
yeah, that was it.
currently being revived, actually. So
Ah, good.
it's a language that died out, and they are the Huron Nation. They live 2 hours from where I am, actually, the center of the Huron Nation. They are currently employing historical reconstructions to revive what the phonology of the language was. So at this stage, we're not 100% sure necessarily that the phonology was exactly as it is presented in some of the songs. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna stay on the safe side for now. I'm gonna just do it in French and English. But yeah, it's a piece of Canadian music, and Canadian
Mm.
music is one of the things that I really want to bring more attention to because we have a very singularly interesting musical culture here in Canada.
In what way, singular?
It's singular in the sense that it's Americans are not as Celtic as people think. There's a lot of German in Americans, for example, and
That's
Americans
what
in
we
their
usually think.
right, right. So there's a lot of German ancestry, and there's a lot of more English ancestry in
Mhm.
the Americans. Canada, meanwhile, sort of the ethnic stock of the original Canadians who settled, after the Native Americans, obviously, I'm talking about the Europeans who settled, they're mostly of Celtic origin. So Canada is a lot more Celtic in its genetic and cultural background than America is. And so you see this in the music.
More
So for
Breton or
example,
Irish.
especially Irish,
Mhm.
especially Irish. So if you talk to native French Canadians here, Quebecois people, all of them have Irish ancestors, and all of them who say I don't have any Irish ancestors, they're the ones who haven't checked their genealogical tree, which is interesting. Which is kind of interesting. There's a lot of and so our songs in Quebec, the melodies are clearly French melodies. Typologically, you look at how the melodies are constructed, very clearly they're from La Lorraine, they're from Provence, they're from these parts of France,
Mhm.
but the way they're played, it's as if Irish musicians were playing them. There's a Irish style to it. So if you hear the Irish fiddle style, for example, it's the same. You wouldn't be able to tell if it's Quebecois or Irish. It's the exact same.
Mhm.
And so it's a strange case of it's the only place in the world where the French language is sung and played with an Irish and Gaelic quality, which is quite unique.
This something which is a mix of Irish and French sounds Breton to me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the Bretons
I'm a
also, it's
tourist,
in,
that's it.
I mean, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, the Bretons also, it is the case because the Bretons, interestingly enough, they began adopting Irish influences in the last century because there was such a strong connection with Celticness in regards to the Irish. There's this idea that Irish and Scottish music is the Celtic sound. And so the Bretons began modifying their own music to be more like the music of the Irish. But if you go back in time before that, the music of the Breton doesn't sound that much like Irish music. It sounds more like French music, actually.
When I'm listening to something to 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 playings of medieval music, it sounds more like ordinary continental court music.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So
That's it.
Breton music in its natural form, let's say,
Mhm.
was much more continentally Northern European in style. But there's this interesting thing in history where, you know, we want to associate ourselves, let's say, with another member of our ethnic group. So we are going to adopt elements of that ethnic group. It's something that happens in a lot of cultures, in a lot of countries. It's a artificial modification of the culture, if you will, for nationalistic or ethnic ideological goals,
Mhm.
which is not necessarily, I mean, I call it artificial, but that happened in history also. So that's also one of the ways that music organically evolves.
Music is not exactly natural, it's a human activity.
Right.
It is
So
artificial by
it's
being an art.
right. That's the thing, because if you go back, the Romans, for example, they artificially began making their music more like Greek music. They went out of their way to make sure that they adopted Greek music theory. But if you go back before the massive, massive Greek influence, maybe their music wasn't as similar. So, you know, but we don't
Maybe
call
we
that
couldn't know
artificial.
that.
We don't really know that, right?
And of
It's
course,
impossible
they
to.
had this contact zone in southern Italy, the
They had this contact zone, yeah.
Greco-Latin zone. Yes,
Right, right.
there was something I once read about. It was a Byzantine letter by Gregorius of Antioch.
Mhm.
It was from the 12th century.
Yeah.
I read it in Bulgarian, of course, not in Middle Greek. And the author said, I had to travel through the country called Bulgaria. Maybe it was modern Serbia where he
Mm,
traveled
mm,
at that moment. And I had to hire a local guide. So he did that. And the local guide kept bothering me, pestering me with the tragudie, with the folk songs about that famous Samuel Bulgarians still mourn even today. The Greek author says, the Byzantine author
the
says.
Samuel the Great, yeah.
Yeah, of course, it was not Samuel the Great, that's Simon the Great, but this one was Samuel,
Okay,
the
okay, yeah.
the most, how to say it, maybe one of the most wanted hero in the Balkans. Every
Yeah,
nation
yeah.
want him for themselves because we have too many nations on a very small patch of land.
Yeah, yeah.
And the Greek author was a little bit interested and charmed, and then a little bit frustrated by his bothering Bulgarian guide or Serbian
Mm,
guide or we don't know what kind of Slavic guide, medieval guide,
yeah.
who was,
A
was
medieval
constantly
Slav, we know
singing
that
on the
much.
road, and we don't know what exactly he sang. And
Hmm.
did he sing or just recite something? But the
Yeah.
Greek author says that these were tragodie,
Hmm.
these folk songs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He uses that term specifically.
Yeah.
That's
And
interesting.
it's really curious. So it seems that 100 years after Samuel had been defeated by Basil II,
Hmm.
um, he was still sung by local people, by peasants, maybe.
Yeah, yeah.
That's curious. But of course, as with many things in the Balkans, we have heard something about that, and we never know the actual thing. Just like something mentioned in Beowulf or in the Iliad, which
Right,
which we don't have the chance to read about.
right.
Sorry, to hear more about. It's this Tolkienian impression of depth which doesn't exist anymore.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Is that reconstructible? At least partly, at least speculatively.
Um, so you said 12th century Balkans, right? That's where I would be like, sure, I could, I would, that's one of the things where I would at least consider the idea. If you were to ask me, for example, the same question about a folk song, of Carthage in the 5th century, I'd be like, no, just forget about
Probably
that,
not.
right?
Yes.
Yeah. But when it comes to the music of the Balkans at that time period, we actually know a fair bit. Of course, you can never reconstruct what the actual song itself literally was, but you can make a song that could have been that song, right?
Hmm.
So that is a possibility, of course, right?
Historically
That
plausible.
a historically plausible song. I
Hmm.
think I wouldn't be closed off to the idea that it would be because by that point, the Slavs had been in contact with the Eastern Romans for a few
Centuries.
centuries by
Six
that point, right?
centuries. Yes.
A few centuries, right? And so I'm actually working right now on a video essay. My next video essay is going to be called "Defining Slavic Music," and the main
Well,
point
that
of
will
the
be
video,
tricky right now.
yeah, especially with the whole like
Fortunately.
political situation and everything. But part of the main point of the video is that terms like Slavic music or Germanic music or Celtic music are ethnomusicologically meaningless because musical styles do not arrange themselves in tandem with ethno-linguistic groups. So you talk to people, for example, who don't know much about ethnomusicology, and they'll say that, oh, Serbian music must sound more like Russian music than Turkish music because they're both Slavs. It's like, no,
Don't make the
not at
mistake,
all.
Yana.
Not at all. Bulgarian music has much more typological features in common with Greeks, with Albanians, with Serbs, with Turks, which are their neighbors.
Of course.
That's the fact of nature that if you put a people in a certain place in the world, they will contribute to and be defined by some of the musical aspects of that place in the world. So we have a pretty good grasp of what Greek medieval music would have been like, at least liturgically we know, right? So the liturgical sound, the Byzantine tradition of chant, we have a very good idea what it sounded like.
Of course, it's almost intact even today.
It's almost intact, yeah. It has changed. So if you ask some Orthodox psalts, they will very proudly tell you that no, it didn't change at all. Some things
The
changed.
same music that Saint Peter sang to Christ himself. That's what
Right?
the
So
psalm will tell you.
some of the psalms will say that, right?
Yeah.
So there have been changes. For example, in the Constantinopolitan, the Hagia Sophia
Mhm.
style of the 11th century, there were eunuchs singing. So
Yes.
men who so I mean, you think of Orthodox chants nowadays, you think of the, Agni Parthen, you think
Yes.
it's very like it's the deep chest, but back then it would have been eunuchs with very high. So it
High
has
pitched.
changed, right? Very high pitch. So there have been some differences, but for the most part, it's almost intact. And of course, the Bulgarians and the Serbs especially are defined by a strong degree of Byzantinification of their culture,
So
if you will.
you're actually telling me that the eunuch tradition in the castrati tradition of Italy starts with the Byzantine Empire.
It might have many things like the organ, for example, right? The church organ,
Mhm.
which is nowadays you think of it as the Catholic or the Protestant thing,
But
right?
it was
That's what
Eastern as well once. Yeah.
it comes from the Byzantine Empire, actually. So they didn't use it in their liturgical music, to be very clear. Their liturgical music was a cappella, but the organ comes from the Eastern Roman Empire into Western Europe.
Another parenthesis,
Yes,
if
yes,
you
yes.
allow me that. Thank
Please.
you. Um, we know that when the Psalter is read, the Psalterion is read, it includes some remarks. This is going to be read or sung by the Corypheus, by the chief of the choir.
Yep.
This is going to be accompanied by this musical instrument or by another one. maybe these remarks are from the times of the Septuaginta, maybe from the times of the Alexandrian Judaism.
Sure, sure.
And these Eastern instruments give us something like these remarks. They give us something like an insight in the Hellenized Judaist music, Hebraic music, but
Yes,
not
yes.
entirely Hebraic anymore. A little bit Hellenized, a little bit
Yeah,
Grecified.
yeah.
Okay, then this maybe is a kind of musical tradition used by the early Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And you give me for the first time, I'm trying to hear in my head Eastern Orthodox music uh, in a high-pitched male voice, in a eunuch voice, which is not really typical for my imagination, for my personal knowledge.
I
I would
think
have
I think
imagined the choirs of Hagia Sophia singing like the modern Simono Petra monks,
right.
very
E-
low-pitched voices.
there's also an interesting thing when Western Europeans traveled to the Eastern Roman Empire, they remarked with surprise that the Greeks mixed female and male voices together. So not only you had high-pitched male voices, you had men and women psalts singing together, mixed.
That's quite modern now in Eastern Orthodox churches throughout
Right, right.
Eastern Europe.
But if you go back actually in the days of the Hagia Sophia and everything, they did that, and the Western Europeans were surprised by that. So on many salient levels, those things change, right? If you are
Things have
interested, I
changed
would,
quite, yes.
I would definitely tell you to listen to there's this album by Capella Romana. I can give
Great
you the link.
musicians, those, yeah.
Yep, great musicians. And so they did the Lost Voices of Hagia Sophia. They have reconstructed chants as
Mhm.
they would have been heard, and they use technology to recreate the reverberation that you would have heard in the Hagia
Yes.
Sophia. And so they mix female and male voices, so it can give you a certain idea. Of course, one of the things you mentioned, imagining Byzantine chant with a high-pitched voice. I have talked with some Orthodox psalts, and I think some of them say that the reason why there's a big insistence on using the chest voice is that structurally speaking, there is a lot of commonality between the liturgical forms of chanting of the Eastern Mediterranean Christian world and the Middle Eastern Muslim world. At a fundamental level, the way
Possibly.
that the Muslims sing has a great similarity with how Byzantine chants is sung, which is my theory is that, and I think it's a very strong theory that I propose, which is that the early Islamic chants would have been modeled on the Christian chants of the Mediterranean basin when they conquered, the Levant and
Syria,
everything.
yes.
Yeah, because
I, I have thought about something like that
yeah,
without being able to be sure of that
yeah,
there are some similarities, some, yes, structural similarities between Eastern Orthodox music and especially monastic singing,
yes,
chanting, and maybe the sound of the muezzin.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
maybe,
yeah,
but that was just a personal opinion. Not I have
yeah,
never researched that. That's nice. And now returning to the previous
yeah.
matter, um, should we, if we attempt any speculative reconstruction of such a Slavic folk singing from the 12th century, should we try to make it like liturgical singing, or maybe
Yeah,
not?
that's an interesting question, right? Because that's a case of evidence bias, as we call it, because all the evidence we have is from the liturgical side. So, for example, I'm actually working, I'm going to be releasing it in a few days, my first actual reconstruction of what late secular Byzantine music would have been like. I've tried a reconstruction because we have, as far as I know, one surviving piece of secular composition, which is from the very end of the empire.
Which sounds like
Otherwise,
Ottoman music.
yeah, pretty much. I mean, I actually, it's funny. So I was like, I'm just gonna put the instruments together, do the melody, and then I was like, oh yeah, it sounds Ottoman for obvious reasons, right? For very obvious reasons. So the problem is, I was like, can I do more of these? And the problem is, well, anything else that I have to do would be to put liturgical compositions and then put them to instruments, for example, right? Or to use the style of, but I'm like, but maybe the liturgical style is different from the folk style.
I would
So
maybe try to avoid that. I'm not a musician and I will not
yeah,
be.
yeah, yeah,
But if I had to think about this as a mental exercise,
yeah.
um, if I had to try to reconstruct the Genisakritos or something like that, or maybe this unknown songs of Samuel,
Yeah.
maybe I would avoid the liturgical temptation.
Yeah, it's the
But what
easiest one
else could you
because
use?
that's
Maybe
the
later
problem.
folk music.
So that's one of the things you can use later folk music, but the problem is that folk
Sorry.
music is incredibly conservative on many levels. So Greek folk music of today continues to use some of the aspects that ancient Greek music used 2,500 years ago.
Fine.
But the configuration of those elements is different. The music still sounds different, right? So it's the same elements, but they're used in a different way where it still sounds different. And so, yeah, I think you could, what I would do personally would be to do like 10 different reconstructions and put them all in the same video, right? That's because the thing with musical reconstructions is that if you're writing a book, for example, and you say that, maybe this happened, maybe that happened, you can write that. The problem is when you're performing music, you have to choose. If you perform, you perform. If you I'm gonna do this ornamentation there, and I don't know if that ornamentation was historically accurate. Well, you've done it. You know what I mean? You can't. It's not like a book where you can just put a maybe and an asterisk and everything. So it's one of
You
the. I
can
have a
make more
joke.
than one record, more than one version.
Exactly. You do one more than one version, which is something that as I begin going into more speculative territory, I'm going to start doing that. I have this joke that if you do speculative historical reconstructions, at the end of the performance, the musicians should put down their instruments and say, like this. I think that gesture is, you know, what I mean?
It's
Because
like the
it's
asterisk in linguistics.
exactly, it's the asterisk. It's you never well, you can never be 100% sure. But I will say that when it comes to medieval music, the thing is, medieval music of Western Europe back then was not fundamentally different from medieval music of the Balkans or Eastern Europe. It was at a point where the differentiation was not there yet. So French music of the 1100s um, had the typological features, or many of the typological features of Serbian or Balkanic music today. So we know that Balkanic is a lot more conservative than Western European music, for example. So I wouldn't be closed off to the idea of looking at even French songs, and deriving some. I think you can get an idea. So here's my final answer, because it's a very interesting question, but there's so many angles to consider.
Yeah.
My final answer would be you can definitely reconstruct the surface level sound. I think the surface level sound can be reconstructed, but you know, the details will never be able to get them.
So basically, you're what it, what we could do is take the melody of the Palestine Iliad and sing the text of the Genesis Sakritis on it.
Right. And it wouldn't be completely off because the melodies were not differentiated yet. I mean, the you look at some melodies of Balkanic folk music today, and they do melodic patterns that are the exact same as Guillaume de Machaut was using in the 1300s.
Oh, there we go.
So there is a level of we do know enough, but yeah, it's the details. We'll never get to know the details necessarily. The thing that survives the most is the instruments because instruments can survive as objects. So we do have a lot of surviving instruments. The problem is you don't know how to play them necessarily.
Ever thought about making Italian medieval music or Renaissance music?
Yeah, I want to make the problem is I want to make Italian music of the Middle Ages. The problem is the Italians, for good reason, they're obsessed with their Renaissance repertoire. So every time you try searching for their music, you'll find
You'll find
Renaissance
only the
music.
Renaissance music, yes.
They're much more they themselves produce the Renaissance music far more. They're not as interested in their medieval music. So Renaissance music is where you find more of that. So I'm gonna try. I'm gonna have to go to Italy and find records and everything because on the internet it's very very difficult to find.
You will find Bardomagno, but I don't advise following that path.
No, okay,
No.
no.
Of course, they're fine musicians, but they're a little bit too jokey.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, no, the Renaissance is really where the Italians find mo mostly have their reconstructions and everything. And the Renaissance is where the split between Western European and Eastern European music begins. It's at the Renaissance that it begins. So before the Renaissance, there's not, if you remove the language, it's very difficult to tell the difference sometimes between, modern Greek and Balkanic music or French music of the 1200s. After the Renaissance is where the differences become very, very evident.
Slightly earlier, when you told me that that you deem that the great cathedrals of the Byzantine world, like Hagia Sophia, like maybe Saint Demetrius in Thessaloniki, were using actually high-pitched eunuch voices and a mix of female and male voices, which is mind-blowing for me. I admit.
Yeah.
That leads me to think that as monasteries did exist during the Middle Ages, maybe there
Yes.
was a distinct difference between church music in monastic communities and in city churches.
Not only
Maybe there
that,
were two traditions of Christian church music within the Byzantine world.
I would say there were 350 traditions because
Yeah, maybe that.
the Hagia Sophia tradition was not the same as the church right next to the Hagia Sophia. They would have not that, by the way, it would have all sounded like Byzantine chant. So it's not like the styles would have been completely different.
Small local differences being preserved meticulously by some local patriot, that's okay. That's absolutely normal.
Right.
But
So
maybe also there was the matter of fashion. We're trying to follow the great church.
yes,
The next
exactly.
church is trying to follow it, or maybe in the
I
next city.
I would guess that the Hagia Sophia would have been the normative settler of fashion, kind of in the way that, let's say, in the Roman Empire, how the emperors cut their hair or they dressed, that became the popular fashion,
Norm, yes.
the norm. I would guess that it was the case. Of course, I want to be very nuanced here. When I say that there were different traditions, one must not imagine that Hagia Sophia would have sounded like Byzantine chant and that the church next door would have sounded like Protestants chanting in an Anglican church. To the normal person, they would not be able to tell the difference. We're talking about very small local traditions, but we have, even to this day, modern Byzantine chant. So when we talk about Byzantine chant today, we're talking about Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, the Levant, to a lesser extent, Hungary and other neighboring regions. But so, for example, myself at the beginning, I couldn't tell the difference between the Romanian style and the Greek style. Now I can pick up the difference. But even today, not only between
Firstly,
countries,
it's the
there's
language, of
differences,
course.
and this will influence how it's sung, obviously, right? The language always has an influence on
Eventually,
the
yes.
eventually. But even today in Greece, there are slight differences between this school and that. So there's the Simon Karas school, for example, and then there's another school from the Peloponnese. So there's,
Local
even
flavor.
today with the internet and with, the nationalization of culture and everything, you have local flavors. So
Ah,
in the Middle
thank
Ages,
goodness, that's a good thing.
oh
And that's
yeah,
what makes Greece a really special place, of course. Yes.
yeah. The diversity of local styles is amazing over there.
Oh, that's really enriching. Yeah. But I'm still keeping that working somewhere in the back
Yeah.
of my head. This about high-pitched Byzantine
Well,
voices.
I mean, it's something that
It'll
I
take me
forgot to
some
men
time.
I forgot to mention it, but that's the thing I said. I talked to some Orthodox salts, and one of their theories is that Orthodox are very hesitant to use more high-pitched voices because if you do, then it pretty much sounds like Muslims singing in Turkey, for example.
And there is another matter as well, because um, after the Westernization of the Russian Empire in the 18th century,
Yes,
and then the beginning of the modern Russian influence on the Balkans, especially in Bulgaria, maybe less so in Serbia,
yeah,
but in Bulgaria for sure, there came something which is like a Russian form of Baroque, and
yes,
it includes female voices. It doesn't include musical instruments, but it sounds like something written in Rome in the Rococo age or something like that.
yes,
It's cream cake. It doesn't sound really orthodox. It sounds more like
yeah.
some Catholic singing in Church Slavonic, which
It's
is
it's it's. I mean, it's interesting, and it's an interesting
it
mixture,
is.
right? There's a lot of
We
that
have these
happening.
two traditions living in Bulgaria right now. We have uh, this 18th century or 19th century Russian Baroque. We do have it
Right.
with female voices. We do sometimes with high pitched male voices as well. Small
Okay.
parties. small parcels of the chant being sung with a very high voice. And
Right.
then we have the somber monastic singing,
Yeah.
which is the entirely male singing with the ison and so on.
Yeah.
And
But the Russian style
these
is
two
not,
are,
but it's not unique to the Catholics. So there are Orthodox churches that do that Russian Baroque style also.
yes, of course.
Okay, okay, yeah. Because
Well,
in
this is
Greece
something
for
entirely among the Eastern Orthodox in
okay,
Bulgaria, maybe in other Eastern European countries as well.
right, right.
But in
Because in
Bulgaria,
some countries,
we
in
can
Greece,
hear
for
it.
example, the Catholic churches they sing like Italian Catholics, but then you go to the Orthodox churches and it's Orthodox. So it's more it's a sometimes the music comes with a denominational division actually that you hear in
Oh,
the
that as
music
well.
even.
Yes, that does
Yeah,
exist.
sure.
Yes, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah,
But
yeah.
also the language is what makes the change. When you go to Greece, now there you hear almost only the monastic singing, the somber singing, the low
Yeah, yeah,
singing,
yeah,
which I personally maybe prefer. But that's a
yeah.
different matter.
Well, I mean, there is this matter, of course, that correct me if I'm wrong. Was Bulgaria in the Soviet Union or at least adjacent to it?
That's a curious question. Bulgaria was not never formally a part of the Soviet Union,
Okay,
but it was so um, close to it in its governance that it looked
right.
almost like a Soviet province.
It was peripheral. It was like a satellite state, basically,
It
if I
was one
understand
of the
correct.
satellite states, yes.
Okay, yeah, like
Yeah.
Romania and everything. Right. So, for example, there is this you have these uh Bulgarian or Serbian revolutionary or political chants that are in that like Red Army choir style also, right? That like communist style that you hear some of them from the 50s and the 40s. You have some in
These are usually
Albania.
from the 50s, yes.
Right, exactly. So there's
Like North
always
Korean
those.
music right now.
I mean, North Korean music is literally like Russian
It's
music of the
Soviet music,
50s.
yes.
It's Soviet music of the 50s, right? Which
Some
is
of the
very interesting.
Chinese music maybe is like that. I don't know.
Probably,
Yeah.
probably it's like that. So there's always this interesting thing where you find these parallel existence of different musical traditions within the same region, one of them perhaps being more native and then others being more. There's also the case, for example, so Bulgarian music is very famous for its tradition of harmony, of harmonizing, of doing different notes at the same time. And the kind of harmony that most people associate with Bulgaria, it's called like les mystères des voix bulgares, the mystery of the
Mm.
Bulgarian voices. It's those female choirs. Those Bulgarians told me those are mostly Western composers sort of doing experimental Western European harmony with Bulgarian choirs and everything, but they're not exactly like the traditional Bulgarian harmony, which is much more like the ison of the monastic style and everything.
This maybe one of the original forms of this harmony is to be heard in some small villages in Western Bulgaria.
Right.
There are those famous old ladies of Bistrica. Bistrica is a village name, a
Yeah.
place name nearby Sofia, where some old ladies uh, sing in a really strange way. It sounds almost like extraterrestrial sound,
Right.
um, because they all have quite high voices, but they sing with their mouths really narrow, open,
Mm.
almost not open at all. They
Yeah.
sing through their teeth,
Right.
and it sounds like a contest of hissing.
That's
It's
interesting.
yeah,
I'm
it
gonna have
is.
to check that out. That was fascinating. Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, there's all those like styles and again the problem is, we could call one of those styles like that's the more native form, but maybe even that one had external influence 500 years ago. So
Probably, we don't know.
yeah,
I
it's
don't know
all
at least.
yeah, it's always relative. It was always relative. What is exactly native, what is not native in a musical tradition.
Well, this is local traditional for the moment. Yeah,
Right,
before
exactly, yeah.
so at least for 100 years, maybe more.
Right, right. So you can date, for example, that yeah, like so this is from the 50s, but this is much older. So for example, the typical Bulgarian traditional folk sound, I am comfortable putting it at least 700, 600 years old and everything. It might have changed a little bit and everything, right? But then people ask me, well, is that the native Bulgarian sound? I'm like, I don't know because
You mentioned something interesting. Tell me what you want to end the conversation because I'm
oh no
quite
no, please,
enjoying it.
please.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation today that our neighbors, the Serbians, have their cycle of Kosovo,
Yes.
which is probably an epic cycle of songs.
Yeah.
Through Bulgaria, through Serbia, and through North Macedonia, there is another, or maybe more than one cycle of epic songs dating from maybe late Middle Ages, 14th century, 15th century. At least the events are from the 14th century, about the lives of King Vukašin and his son Marko, the king's son.
Mhm.
I believe you have made one of the many songs about Marko.
I did, but well, it's only instrumental actually.
Yeah,
There's no, but it's Marko Kraljevic, yeah.
yeah, precisely. But Marko Kraljevic or Marko Kraljeviti or Kralji
Right.
Marko, as we call him in Bulgaria.
Right.
And strange thing is, in Bulgaria, we don't have something like a national epic. We don't have our Iliad or
Hmm.
our Beowulf or our Gilgamesh,
Yeah.
except this mention of songs about Samuel from the 12th century. But we do have this cycle of shared epic with the Serbians and our North Macedonian neighbors,
Yeah.
which is actually a finished metatext. It begins with the reign of King Vukašin. It keeps going on with many adventures with the end of Momčil, whose sister Vukašin takes for a wife, with then the birth of Marko, then the life of Marko, the adventures of Marko.
Yeah.
Some of these are highly comical, actually, and
Yeah.
sometimes obscene, which is
Yeah.
really funny. And then with the end of Marko, who
Yeah.
ends a little bit like King Arthur, sleeping in a cavern or something like that,
Yeah.
and waiting to return to help the Balkans once again, of course.
Which is a common mythological motif you find across many,
Right,
many
like Friedrich
cultures.
Barbarossa or something like that. Yeah,
Right, right.
and these this cycle of texts, this cycle of many folk songs, which actually published together, form an epic, a
Mhm.
chronological epic in its own right. Maybe this is singable, not exactly
Yeah.
reconstructible because it doesn't need to be reconstructed. It is still sometimes performed part by part
Yeah.
throughout southwestern Bulgaria or parts of Serbia or parts of North Macedonia.
When they perform it, do they sing it or do they only recite it?
Recited, more like. It's a
Right. So it's
melodical recitation. 100 years ago, in the beginning of the 20th century, they maybe accompanied it with the gusla.
in Bulgaria.
Oh, well, we call that usually not exactly gusla. We call it, maybe it's not exactly the same instrument.
Okay, okay, okay.
It's made out of pear tree, and
Interesting.
it's in Bulgarian it's called gadulka.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I know the one. Yeah, it's much smaller. It's like shorter than the gusla of the
Yeah,
Serbians, Egadulka. Yeah, interesting. So
those who recited those songs, they were called guslari.
interesting. Just like the, and I mean, this is also an interesting thing, right? Because you have the same term, gusli and everything, guslari, is also found in the Eastern Slavic traditions of the Ukrainians, the Russians, the
Mhm.
Belarusians, but their gusla is it's not even a bowed instrument. It's a plucked kind of zither instrument that's completely
No, no, no,
different.
we never had that.
Yeah,
And of
yeah,
course,
yeah,
most of those players, those guslari,
yeah.
they claimed to be blind in order to be guided to the place of like a wedding or some other festivity, and then they
Interesting.
could play that. They
Interesting.
pretended to be blind, much like Homer.
I will definitely have to check. So this cycle of King Vukašin that you're mentioning, I suppose there are this is shared with the Serbs and the North Macedonia, the other
Yes,
South like, but there are I suppose
and
there
there
are
are other
Bulgarian,
heroes, other characters within, and other villains in this cycle. It's a
yeah,
very large one.
yeah. There's like the Hungarian king, I think, who comes at some point, meets Marko Kraljevic or something.
Philip Majarina, yeah,
Right, right, right.
Philip the Hungarian, yeah.
Yeah, and then there's Marco who fights like the Albanian guy and everything. It's one of the most fascinating. I'm actually because there are no English translations of those, unfortunately, mostly. So it's one of those that fascinates me the most. But I'm gonna try to find some. The one that you mentioned, I would suppose that there are Bulgarian versions as well as Serbian versions, right?
I suppose so. Yes, at the very least, they would differ in dialect and maybe in orthography because they have been collected by different anthropologists.
You're right, right.
But maybe also they share many common traits.
Interesting. So you would have like a spectrum of these same mythological motifs, those same stories and everything
Mhm.
that would have constituted an epic cycle. But I suppose I feel like the
But an
Serbs.
epic cycle in in a heap state, not
Yes.
without the work of some learned clerk who would make it into a poem.
Right, that's the thing. It was never, it's not like, let's say, because in Iran, for example, Ferdowsi did that with the Shahnameh. So the Shahnamehs are epic poem, but the Shahnameh, he didn't write any of the characters. All of those were Zoroastrian, Iranian mythology. He just placed them in that one book, and this is the book that is now the official canonical version. But
Something
most of
like
those,
maybe like what happened with the Kalevala in Finland.
exactly, that's
Yeah.
good. The Kalevala was not like some original novel or something. It was a bunch of different local traditions and everything. And
Songs and traditions, yes.
right, right. That's the one that, but I feel like the Serbs have elevated it to a much more national status
Mhm.
rather than the, because as you mentioned, I feel like in Bulgaria, it's not treated like the national epic. But I feel like for the Serbs, the cycle of Kosovo, it has like that official national place in their country.
In Bulgaria, usually it's more like something like mythological songs being
Mm.
more popular. Songs where usually it is sung about like the wedding of the sun.
Right.
It is a common motif in a long series of various songs on one and the same topic
Yeah.
about the girl being abducted by the sun
Right.
and becoming his bride.
I will definitely have to look into that cycle of King Vukašin because, as I said, like my favorite thing is to put epic poems to music. Like that's what if I could do that, I would love to work with Bulgarian musicians and everything because it's such a fascinating mythological cycle that is completely unknown in
Things
the
have been
Anglosphere.
published in
To
Bulgarian, but
yeah,
I don't know if they have been translated in French or English or some Western
yeah.
language.
I'll have to do some research because there's a lot of fascinating mythology that is completely unknown in the English-speaking world, right? That like Marko Kraljevic and everything, he's fighting the Turks and and the Sultan comes, he's like, stop hitting my soldiers and everything. Like there's all these comical things. And when I learned about it, I was like, this is amazing. Like, why didn't I, know about those earlier? There's a lot that we don't know about in the English-speaking world and everything because of a um larger focus, I suppose, on Western Europe and its traditions, which of
Well,
course has
it's
its own
better
merits, of
marketing is
course.
better marketing. That's it.
Right, there's also that, of course. Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
I'm good. Definitely gonna have to look into that, the cycle of King Vukašin. But yeah, when it comes to, I mean, whether it's reconstructible, of course, when you look at how the music is performed, how the poems are performed with the Serbs, for example, it's this like three notes, right? And they play on the
He
goose like
knows.
this. Yeah, I think it's three intervals, and they just sing those three intervals over and over again, like in different patterns, basically. They don't sing full-fledged complex melodies when they're doing the Kosovo cycle. It's a very
It's like a
and actually,
recitation. It's repeating itself.
yeah. So you choose three basic notes, and just go with that. And there's actually a theory that this may have been the case with the Iliad, that the Iliad may not have been sung necessarily to complex melodies, just like the three same repetitive fundamental notes, and there's reason to believe that may have been the case.
Maybe the three stresses of ancient Greek
Yeah.
give us this insight. Why three stresses? Only three. There are no more stresses.
Right, and it might be that they only put that to three different notes. There's a possibility of that, of course. There's a possibility, of course, that they would have had. It may have been both. Also, it may have been a spectrum that some of them did more complex compositions based on it. Some of them limited it. Some of them probably also did not recite it to the lyre. I think there would have been recitations that were far more, I was talking about the Aeneid, for example. There is this built-in rhythm, of course, arma, virunque, cano, troia, qui, but you can also do it more naturally. Arma, virunque, cano, troia, qui primus, and more like spoken word.
Maybe
And
the
I'm,
more natural form is better suited to the metamorphosis by Ovid,
yes, yeah, probably.
being more a more modern text in its purpose.
Yeah, yeah, it might be the case, right? So I'm open to believing that there would have been a spectrum of more natural delivery in those epic poems, and then limited ones with three to four notes, and then perhaps more complex compositions. It's difficult to know.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I would continue this, but I will never be able to finish the work on it if I go over.
Yeah. You have enough subtitles and everything to write that, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
Right.
so I have to thank you for the moment. It was a great conversation, a great interview.
Thank you, Manuel. It was great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Farya. Hope we'll do that again, and good luck.
And
We'll
send
see
me the link
you.
to the video, and I'll share it so my viewers can
Yes,
see the
I would
thing.
have asked that from you. Thank you very
All
much.
right.
Thanks once again.
Thank you very much. Have a nice evening. This evening,
Have a
really. Have
nice
a nice evening.
have a nice day, you too.